Yeah, so we're here, and wanted to say thank you for joining us to do this. It's something about Nigeria at 60, and we thought who best to talk to about Nigeria at 60 other than somebody who also just turned 60 and who also straddles so many parts of what is in Nigeria that is constantly moving. You're a geologist, you're a culture advocate, you are a journalist, you publish a magazine, so you understand the Nigerian economy also. And so we wanted to see what your perception of Nigeria is. But I wanted to start from, at what age did the word Nigeria come to your consciousness?
Okay, let me quickly respond to some of the things you've claimed about me. When your viewers hear this, all of these things, they will think those are genuine achievements. A whole lot of things are being done in some very unstructured way. So you could be the geologist who manages to write once in a while, and then it makes you, and you assume that you could publish some of the things.
No, but I mean,
write.
At least as a geologist, you did a whole lot in the oil industry. So
okay, so
we can take that away
since you are insisting, let's go back to your question now. My generation was the one that fought, for the liberation. I mean, the one that was quite young, when the consciousness of the liberation of South Africa, was happening. I'm trying to tie it to that your newspaper thing. You start to be very conscious about what country you come from, largely in your secondary school. In Form 4, the gentlemen who murdered the Soweto massacre thing were also relatively in Form 4, in our own Form 4. And so the guys who were leading the South African Revolution were essentially our age mates. I remember a name like Tsetsi Mashinini, So that's one stage of consciousness. But don't forget that we were 7, our age. We were 7 when the Civil War broke out. Naturally, the Civil War was about sovereignty, and it was about Nigeria and the other. So we knew we were Nigerians, and the other guys were Biafrans. So now as a 7-year-old, who sat in front of grainy black and white TV, watching combat, that wartime movie, and feeling like, that must be the way Babade next door, the gentleman who you knew went to war. That must be the way he must have been crawling somewhere in present day Imo State. That's kind of imagination. But yes, so the Gowon had this thing called, we had this slogan. They said, to go on with one Nigeria. That was Gowon. And then to keep Nigeria one is a task that must be done. So if you hear all of those things around you, even though you are, the period of the war was 7 to 10. When 4 or 5 months to my 10th birthday, one soldier was holding a newspaper in front of our house, Daily Times. The war ends January 1970. So that's pretty how I knew that we must be Nigerians, and every other person must be somebody else. Yes.
Interestingly too, because I think it was about the age of 6 or 7 that the word Nigeria came to my own consciousness, and it was the I don't know if I should use the word assassination of Murtala Mohammed, the bloody coup that took his life. And I was about 6 or 7, and I remember that on Bank Anthony there were soldiers from on the length and breadth of, because of course the cantonment was next door to Police College Ikeja, where I grew up, and I was wondering what has happened, and they said they just killed the head of state, and I think it was from there I started hearing the word Nigeria. So it's interesting that at that age, what we experience will be civil strife, if you like, in the country. How do you think that affected Nigeria?
Actually, we were products. I mean, we're largely, generation. I mean, we're largely related in generation. When you mentioned that now, I remember, seeing, I think it was about a week ago when I was watching the movie again, 1976, and it brought back all those memories, and it's a very good movie. It's probably one of my best Nollywood movies. And as, that period is, those Peugeot 404. Yes, we're a generation that grew out of conflict. When you say, for example, that you were born in 1960, which was meant to be the herald of a new nation. It was meant to be possibilities. Don't forget that you actually weren't born. It wasn't like you were conscious of all that freedom. It is when you begin to understand, how the world works. That's actually when your consciousness or begins. And it is that kind of period. Our first consciousness was about war, was about military coups, was about strife. It wasn't until I was 39 plus that we got into democracy that has lasted this long. I wasn't, I spent the first 41 years of my life, in a telephoneless environment, But the one thing that I do know is that there was almost electricity around the clock, when I was growing up. That's probably the only thing that I could say, because it was genuinely problematic whenever they took the light. Everybody screamed in the neighborhood.
That's interesting to note, because I know that recently I read some old paper from 1970 something, and they were talking about power for all by so date. So I think that we've always had this issue of lack of power. It probably has just gotten worse.
It's not that it's probably just gotten far worse. When we say, for example, if you go to Accra, there's power, or you don't forget that the Accrans themselves don't think that they have power all the time. So these things are relative. The point I'm making is that you get 8 hours to 10 hour power supply in Lagos, Nigeria in 2020, but you got probably 14 or 15 hours of power supply in Lagos, Nigeria in 1967. That's the comparison. Roughly 30 million Ghanaians, have access to maybe 3,500 megawatts of electricity. That's not good. Less than 6 million Finns, have far much more power than that. But it's relative in Africa. So what is power? I was in Cairo in 2002, and I remember reading a memo that they were going to take electricity from so and so time, and they were complaining, but these guys were being supplied as of that time 23,000 megawatts of electricity, 70 million Egyptians, and so there's always that challenge, when you don't think you've supplied everybody. So yes, so it's a relative thing.
But before we go into power supply, electricity,
which is pretty boring, let's talk about life.
All of that, I wanted to take you back to the 50s, even though I know that you were not born in the 50s, but I
Of
know
course.
that you probably would have heard stories from people who were born there, so e.g. from your parents. And is it possible to tie life in the 50s and in the 60s, maybe into the 70s, from their perspective, and see how Nigeria has moved from there into independence in 1960, and did Nigeria change that much?
Okay. One of the things, as I said earlier, you don't get the consciousness, as when you're born. So I'm not privy to pre-independence Nigeria. As a matter of fact, what I know is a Nigeria of military, for most of the time. My parents are creature of fun, or were creature of fun. My parents met at ballroom dancing at the Olaya House in Tinubu Square. They got married in 1949, which means they must have met. The courtship didn't take time. I mean, when they married, he was 27, she was 23.
We don't get married that early these days.
Exactly. So if you talk to your children about meeting at ballroom dancing, you're trying to tell them that you had a blast in your time. I remember, some of those places in the Tinubu area, Darusha, that top, up very close to what is now called CMS. I mean, that building that ExxonMobil used to be. It's a bookshop house.
CMS.
If you know the bookshop house, all that Broad Street.
Yeah.
Now, there was a building before you get there. If you're coming from Tinubu, that was roughly the Darusha. Okay. Now, up on the top floor.
I mean, I know the name. I don't know the area. Seeing that I didn't grow up in Lagos.
Well, up on the top floor.
Well,
there,
I mean, if I grew up in Lagos, it was restricted to certain part of.
Lagos. I mean, the thing is that don't look, that restriction just started to happen 15 to 20 years ago. There was no mainland island dichotomy.
Really?
Sure.
No, I used to remember coming to Ikoyi and feeling excited that I was
not what I mean is that
to some city of the very privileged.
Okay. Let me break it down. I mean, today, for example, the top nightclubs are on the island. The galleries are on the island, right? What I mean is that in those days, there's a sense that culture is produced in the mainland and consumed on the island. People say that, painters, sculptors, they live in Ajangbadi and co, claiming that they needed space, whereas it's really that they don't have money to afford. And then they exhibit, at 21 here. Yeah. So the point I'm making is that dichotomy wasn't there. The most important night places in the 70s in the world on the mainland, whether it was a Fela shrine or whether it was Paradiso, in Yaba, or whether it was Arts Place in Yaba, or whether it was,
there's a place called Fame,
Phase 2.
Phase 2.
Yeah, yes. which was also, you see, I was talking about that was on Jibo.
Yes.
And so those are all mainland. The only, I think in 1986, Tunde Kubwe made the move, from Museum Center to
Just
Estate. That, I think, was a fairly significant shift of nightlife to the island. And then this gentleman, Olisa Dibwa, who looks like a young man, really isn't, I think, he had something much more generally around here. One small party when the Ipitombi or some group of dancers from South Africa, they came, we had an after party, it was a blast. it was the first real party session post 12 midnight that I remember about happening on the island. So-called. So the point I'm making is that that dichotomy that it wasn't there like that. Ikoyi may be awesome, but it wasn't the place that was happening. It was Surulere nightclub. It was Surulere that was Richard Mofe was chasing this girl somewhere in the 80s, somewhere in Surulere, and it was big deal to him. It was big deal to everybody. This. So that's the thing. But that's not the question you asked. I've taken myself to
we're actually talking about what you heard your parents talk about, which you've answered.
So in a sense, so they tell me that they had a blast, and they talked about the period, and quite a number of people talk about all of those great high life guys in some kind of way. Like there was a lot of traveling to and fro, whether you are in Benin. And that's another thing. The dichotomy in Lagos that's at the level of island mainland, now, which wasn't there. Also wasn't there at the level of whether you are in Benin or Port Harcourt. There were places that were happening even in supposedly not, what you might call second tier cities. Whether it was someone like Rex Lawson, holding the ground in Port Harcourt, or whether it was someone like Osei or More Joseph holding the fort in Benin. There were always things that were major, but today you don't say those kind of things. Everybody has to come to Lagos. I think at least that's the sense that I get, and people.
We'll come to that. To the Lagos aspect of the Nigerian history at some point. But I think it's important to talk about oil.
Okay.
And when we discovered oil. There's this notion that if the British knew that we had oil in such large quantity that we probably wouldn't have gotten independence that early. Do you share that opinion?
No, the reason why I do not is that if you look at the settler economies of Africa, they're in those places where the weather suits them. So it might be a coincidence. It's certainly not a coincidence that you had all that gold in Johannesburg and all of that uranium and platinum on the southern tip of the continent, and they stayed there. But it's also a temperate weather. The tropics were not favorable to them. They had their flower plantation in Kenya. They settled on the hills. In Kikuyu land, which you read in Ngugi wa Thiong'o's, so those are settler places, Zimbabwe, and it was largely because, if you consider that Zimbabwe doesn't have, in terms of resources, it doesn't even have any of these things, but they settled there. So
think it was inevitable?
No, it was. They basically wanted to leave, and then if you read all of that history of Lagos that is coming out, that has always been, whether it's a Patudele Cole or Shupo or whatever, you find out that they were dealing with hot-headed people. They were different kinds of people. These were different kind of Africans, the South Africans, kind of over time evolved as revolutionaries, but there had always been, which is the point Shupo is trying to make in some of those things, that these were harder guys. They made it hotter for Igbos. They were. You can imagine a typical civil servant, having challenges, big, massive challenge with his landlord, black man, in Lagos. Those are the kind of people that they were dealing with. So that at some level you had all these characters, and at another level you had the mosquitoes and you had the tropical challenges. So I don't think it was, they would have.
I mean, mosquitoes, tropical challenges,
yes,
were things that they dealt with for about 100 years. So
no, the point I'm making is that if you look at the narrative history of, say whether it is South Africa or Kenya or Zimbabwe, people farmed. They were white people. They farmed. They developed factories on their own. They wanted to stay. There's no sense that you had that tendency of, this is my country here. So when you talk about white South Africans, you're actually talking about, people who consider themselves, of that place, and they've been there, the Boers, the first of them that came before the British came and chased them away, and chased them into these places that are called the Free State now, in the so-called Voortrekker, whatever, I mean, the point is just to respond to your question about whether they would have, if they would, you could see the footprints in terms of the several things that they were willing to stay and be a part of here. What I'm saying is, in relative terms, they were not as keen, to
continue to stay in Nigeria
as they were about, in those other places.
Well, interesting, but eventually we found oil, which
found oil,
which is a huge blessing to Nigeria.
Sure.
But at the same time, in so many quarters,
that's true,
we're beginning to think that it's a curse.
Well, I mean, we also need to be very careful.
Maybe not that word in particular.
No,
it's giving us some sort of disadvantage for us not to look at other resources that's correct, that we have.
That's correct. I mean, you have the standard narrative that if we didn't focus just on one, we would have had a far much more multifaceted economy. My challenge is this: when I look at the entire continent and I look at how badly run everywhere is, I'm wondering whether, if we just had coffee, the Kenyans had coffee, it's not a better run economy. The Ugandans had tea or whatever, it's not a better run economy. The Botswana that we talk about, there's still poverty of less than 3 million people with all that diamond. It's supposedly one of the better run economies on the continent. But I don't like to say that we should be comparing ourselves with ourselves. Why can't you compare Botswana with, again, Finland, I keep going back there, again, Sweden. I'm talking about countries that don't have population, that are that big, and then and don't also have resources. And I know that the response of a whole lot of people was that Europe pillaged Africa and used its resources to develop. But if you also look at some of these countries, they didn't necessarily. Some countries in Europe didn't necessarily want part of the colonial history, and they managed to develop themselves. Is it a European thing? Is the industrial mindset a problem for Africa? I mean, why is it so difficult for the Ghanaians to think large scale industrially? Why is it only in Africa that you have so-called small scale farmers?
Conversation that I was having with someone not too long ago, and we were talking about how many companies do we have in Africa?
Mm-hmm.
Let's not talk of Nigeria, that are up to 100 years.
That's number one. And number
So
two is
maybe not even 50 or 60. I'm not sure. We have any company in Nigeria that is up to 60 years, do we?
I'm not sure. I mean,
Nigerian owned.
Okay, yeah, because I was
mean,
going to say UAC
about,
and co.
let's not talk about the
No, you're right. I mean, when I was growing up,
businesses
they were talking about the dollars. Yeah, I know that is cliche. If I start saying that now, you're right. I mean, they're not that. I mean, and it would be very unfair to start naming names, but it's true that there are not that many, companies that grow beyond the first generation. And part of the thing is also rent, is also that the patriarch, that's the founder of the family, farm, typically is a networker, so he benefits a lot from government largesse. His products, his children may not be predisposed, and then you have that then collapses. Yes, it's I mean, quite some people will respond to you to say that the industrialization history of Europe is far longer back, and that there have been all of those similar things in the years past. It's not something that is, I mean, that I think it's a fairly complex conversation than something that one will just but you're right to point it out. It's problematic.
There's a conversation
but
now that
I have a problem with insistence on not having scale. I mean, that people just like to do these things small. I mean, whereas the sense in Europe is that if you lay it all out, you will have a market.
So I guess that the next conversation will be how relevant will oil be in Nigeria in the next 20 years?
Okay, well...
let me add, where should we be moving to? What should we be looking at?
No, I mean, if you talk about you've put Nigeria there, so you've already reduced the context yourself. It will be relevant for us in the next 20 years, certainly. In terms of the globe, in terms of the world, the anticipation is that the fossil fuel era begins to wind down by 2040. By 2050, I mean, the main vehicles will be electric cars, they won't. But of course, one thing that people don't discuss is where is that electricity coming from? Electricity you can actually be coming from gas-fired. So the electricity that you're using to charge the car might still have originally started as hydrocarbon. So that's that. But there's also the fact that there's a lot of work on energy storage, the kind of batteries that you will begin to have that will hold electricity for a long time, that's so if you break through in battery storage, I mean energy storage, it will really serve death knell, of a whole lot of things. But what I'm seeing, the figures that I'm seeing in several of the forecasts is that, Africa itself, will be demanding, crude oil and gas well into the mid-2040s. Africa will be demanding jet fuel, that is the same conventional jet fuel. It will still be increasing here. In terms of road fuel, which is gasoline, and jet fuel, which is, DPK, those, higher level kerosene, you will internally, we will still be consuming this. Europe, I mean, the energy transition era, which is roughly 2025, 2030 to say 2045, will happen at different speeds in different parts of the globe. So the Norwegians, the Dutch, the Finns, the Swedish, I'm talking about, the Scandinavians, who are so focused on green energy and coal, they would, be moving far away from, from gas and, hydrocarbon, faster, in my view, than the Spanish, the Italians, the British, So Europe itself, even within Europe, the speeds at which countries move out of the hydrocarbon era will be different. I mean, will be, even though you have all the standard, Paris Climate Accord and all that, there seems to be, I mean, everybody, quite a number of the oil companies are talking about net zero by 2050. Now, that net zero, is a lot of things. It is either that everything that you're using in your fields, as much as possible, will have zero fossil fuel. But you might still be producing crude oil. It's just that you might be powering your, say, platform with solar, which in a sense, if you're still producing fossil fuel, it must be having market somewhere. Now, the fossil fuel that would emerge, before, the entire fossil fuel era goes away, the one that would, that will still prevail is natural gas. The one that is winding down is crude oil. As I'm speaking to you, there are billions of dollars investment taking place in Mozambique that will, build LNG that are in size that's already bigger than the size of it. The so-called train 7, the train 7 that we're all talking about will take us to 30 million tons per annum. The 2 or 3 trains that they are talking about in Mozambique is already going there. One is 12 and one is 15. That's already on the 7. And they are going to get those things into market roughly 2027. So they are already, even at the beginning, they met us, but why would any company be investing that much? And these are American companies, these are European companies. It's because, okay, so you are making an investment of $50 billion and you're telling me that the market won't be there in 20 years. So this is, they must be saying something, which is the reason why I'm saying that speed, so that the 2040, the 2050 may not be as sacrosanct as we're looking at it. Now, to come to what that means for us.
Yes.
As I said, we're not going to be getting into the electric vehicles the way Europe gets into it. We will need the gasoline for those cars. We will still have combustion engine cars, late into the 2040s. So, yes, we should be worried for any investment that is going to be 30-year long, but anything that is in the span of 20, that shouldn't be a problem.
This is where I worry. So if we're producing, gasoline and all of that for our own consumption,
yes,
and we depend on Europe and the West for technology, and they are moving their technology faster than we are adopting their technology. What does that mean for us?
Yes. what that means is that as much as possible as we're building these refineries, that we must worry a lot about localization. What you're right, because the guys who are licensing, some of the facilities, some of the equipment, when they say license, it means that it's the technology of distillation, it's the technology of refining. And these guys are going to dispense with it, at some point, because they will no longer need them, Yes, but I'm saying that if we're working with, once you know that you have a band of 30, you have a 30-year band, you need to worry a lot about localization, and of course begin to, have your model, when you're calculating all your scenarios, that it doesn't go. I hope that someone like Mr. Dangote knows all of these things, The characters in NPC who are still saying that they will repair something that they ought to have repaired, 25 years ago, and they will overhaul, and they keep on saying it. It will suddenly be scrapped anyway once, that refinery in the east of Lagos, begins to operate. But you're also right that even that one is dated in terms of who supplies the technology to it. Yeah. So we should all be worried about those things. We cannot keep saying that we are still using combustion engines, especially when we're not even the ones manufacturing these cars. So those are issues. And what also that means is that in terms of the market for the crude, it's diminishing, So what you're going to be getting, and we do know that the economics for gas, in terms of what you get back on gas, at least now, as we're speaking in 2020, is far less than what you get back for crude oil, and I stand to be corrected. So we will basically struggle if these two remain the key products of our economy. So it's problematic, Okay. And anybody who is a geoscientist today should be worried. As a matter of fact, I belong to an association called Nigerian Association of Petroleum Explorationists. And just 2 days ago, we had this conversation about, we have this phrase, our ideas find oil and gas. In 20 years, what does that mean? If you are going to attend, university in 2030, are you still going to read geology? You might read geology because you need to find those minerals. But are you still going to be reading petroleum geosciences as, special as like you're having a master's in?
Because it will be dated.
Or are you going to be reading energy science? What will you be reading, in 2030, in 2035? That's just 10 years.
What's your guess?
Well, we're already telling ourselves, and we're talking to, people who are doing the curricula, that the so-called reservoir engineer, is beginning to be a dated idea, and that, engineering is engineering. It's all about, material balance. So you need to begin to structure those curricula, in a way that it seeks to solve energy problems and not necessarily to find crude oil. Just find or as it is, what the reservoir engineer does is the flow assurance, is to get, the geologist looks for the oil. The reservoir engineer ensures that it comes out. Somebody has to ensure that that thing flows out. It's not the job of the guy who looks for it. The guy who looks for it just says, hey, look what I'm seeing. if you drill up to that 12,000 meter, below the sea floor, you are going to find something, that is as big as from here to Ibadan, and it goes to sleep. But somebody then, and when it is found, somebody then say, oh, well, this is 12, degrees, blah, blah, blah. It's waxy, it can't move. How do we take it out? This is not sweet crude that we know. All of those calculations are done by somebody else. And that's the person that's
it's a lot of information.
Those people are
not... a lot of information on oil and gas, but let's agree that drilling crude oil in Nigeria
is a dated.
It's good for Nigeria. It's dated now. So we need to move on to something.
That's
else.
Correct, yes.
What do we move on to?
Well, right now, the energy, what you call the energy transition is on course. There are all kinds of solutions. Number one, one of the challenges that we have is that we're so focused on we're so sold. We've spent far much more money, in the last 13 years. Don't forget that the Electricity Reform Act was signed into law in 2005.
Right, yeah.
In the last 15 years, we focused on converting what used to be a hydroelectric fired economy into a gas-based economy, gas-fired economy. And we're now realizing that even the gas-fired economy is going to go away, But the solar, in our own case, the solar and wind and all those other technologies, they are not coming in fast enough. And the thinking of government is still on how to use, but the difference between electricity and, say, selling crude or selling gas outside is that, well, it's here. Those gas turbines, you can make them, you can find a way of making them yourselves. Those are easier to do than whatever it is that you're trying to do in refineries. So the point I'm making is that we're not moving fast enough for solar. But I'm not also sure, and there's all these, this is a country of water. There's Mambila, is a massive 3,500 megawatts project that we haven't, officially started. There are quite a number. Everywhere you look in Nigeria, there's water. If you go to Kogi State, you think that you are on the edge of the Atlantic. Whereas these are just rivers. They just have massive, if you go to Kanu, there are rivers, So everywhere you look, there's a hydroelectricity possibility. And they don't have to be massive. You can just have them for communities. Yeah. So the whole idea of the energy mix needs to be understood. If you have so much wind in Gwagwalada or in Kafancha, why can't you just erect the wind farms in those places? If the intensity of the sun is highest in Abuja, why don't you actually have solar plants, solar making plants in those places? But we've not even begun to think in that scale yet. So you're right. So where do we go? So that's where we should be going. Right. We should be going in the area of a diverse energy mix. But don't forget that these also come with costs. There's already, in a way, in the country, we've invested enough for gas to be relatively cheap. We've invested in pipelines, we've invested, so such that particular resource is relatively cheaper. But if you want to build, the Mambila would not cost you anything less than $10 to $15 billion. It will be a massive, maybe not up to that, maybe $7 billion.